Oftentimes we think of racism, we think of those overt forms of racism. You think of those exchanges that are derogatory and offensive to our people. But in a lot of cases, that racism is very much structural. Use the term institutional if you'd like, or systemic. Those forms of racism are a part of everyday life for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. It is part of how we become a part of this land use planning. And I think one of the best examples is the Planning Act itself and the profession of planning. That is entirely 100% created from a non-Indigenous perspective, or that colonial perspective. And it's important to keep that in mind, that we are continuing to move on a form of planning, a whole profession, a whole systemic process that's been entirely created in that colonial mindset. So part of the challenge today, and part of the challenge of organizations such as Shared Path, is to start looking at things from the perspective and worldview of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit.
One similarity that cuts across Indigenous cultures is the emphasis on our relations with each other and our relations with the land. And I think that's probably, that's really what's meant when we're talking about decolonizing. We are not, whereas in Western capitalist colonial ideology, the individual is centered, and there's sort of the main modus operandi to the whole thing is extracting as much value as you can out of the land and out of people and out of extracting things as much as you can. Whereas when you're decolonizing and when you're approaching things from the Indigenous perspective, the thing you're emphasizing is your relationships with people and your relationships with the land, and having good relations with people in the land.
It's been historically the context that, if we thought we could hunt and fish and gather, that's not the case in the minds of the municipality, the residents, the people who've come to live here and bought the land through the government. Until somebody comes and starts to work with us, and they go because they'll say, how come you can't do this? You can't do that. And then when you try, well, you try it, and they realize the barriers that we're up against. I've worked with many people over the years and say, I can't believe they act like this. When they, as a non-native educated person who goes to the table for us, and then they hit the roadblocks, and it's like, then they realize for sure what we're up against.
There's a Métis scholar, Jennifer Deasy, who's really carefully studied the media on reporting on these kinds of issues, and has found that there's a really crafted and specific narrative that is perpetuated about Indigenous peoples as terrorists, as internal terrorist threats. And this is a language that gets used a lot to describe these kinds of incidents. And this is important and significant because talking about Indigenous peoples in this way, describing them as terrorists, right, at one hand is a way of saying they're not part of Canada. They're not part of our public discourse and decision-making, but also it invites really heavy-handed police responses, right? And in both of those cases, Oka to Oka and Caledonia, we see, not just a heavy-handed police response, but a military response. Audra Simpson points out that the military intervention at Oka was the largest deployment of the Canadian military at that time since the Korean War, right? So it's quite significant.
We got some major Supreme Court rulings. We got ONRA. We got the Truth and Reconciliation. I say we come through the door with a big stick now. So let's talk about what the future will be.